You're listening to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, January 2026. It's the start of our 10th year. Welcome to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, where we host conversations with authors and artists from Chicagoland and around the world. I'm Dylan Zavagno, and today I am very excited to share this conversation with writer Adam Morgan about his new book, A Danger to the Minds of Young Girls, Margaret C. Anderson, Book Bans, and the Fight to Modernize Literature. It just came out in December from Atria One Signal Publishers. Morgan's book is the first biography solely devoted to Margaret C. Anderson, the founder of the avant-garde literary and arts magazine The Little Review, which she began publishing in Chicago in 1914. The influential Little Review showcased many famous writers of its time, but it would become most celebrated and notorious for being the first publisher of James Joyce's towering modernist novel Ulysses. After putting out nearly two-thirds of the novel in serial installments from 1918 through 1920, Margaret Anderson and her romantic partner and co-editor, Jane Heap, were charged and found guilty of obscenity under the Comstock Act for distributing James Joyce's sexually frank passages through the mail. They were deemed a danger to the minds of young girls. The book, A Danger to the Minds of Young Girls, tells a very compelling story of an iconoclastic woman who was determined to make a space for difficult and challenging art and whose efforts changed forever what could be addressed in literature and what could be considered beautiful. Adam Morgan is himself the founder of the indispensable Chicago Review of Books and a great promoter of the literature of our city. We are especially thrilled to be having this conversation now, as I am just beginning a 6-month discussion group on Ulysses here at the library. Listen to hear why Ulysses wouldn't exist without Chicago and how understanding Anderson's fight helps reveal the true stakes, triumphs, and world-changing dangers of James Joyce's masterpiece. Here's my conversation with Adam Morgan. Adam, welcome. I am so excited to talk to you. To all of our listeners, I have to say, A Danger to the Minds of Young Girls, Margaret C. Anderson, Book Bans, and the Fight to Modernize Literature is a really intense joy to read for anyone interested not just in modern literature or book bans, which is certainly a live issue, as I know, at the library, but also anyone interested in the history of queer people, lesbian women especially, or the intersection of art and politics, or just people who love a great biography. It's really readable. It has these, novel-like scenes about a very complicated woman whose life was devoted to very difficult literature. There's so many reasons I'm really excited to talk to you. One is that I'm about to start leading a 6-month discussion series on Ulysses at the library here. We have 30 people signed up or maxed out. And this book is actually a local connection to Chicagoland. I think it's fair to say Joyce's novel would not exist without the city of Chicago, and your book proves it. I also just want to say that this episode will be the first episode of my 10th year of podcasting for the Deerfield Public Library. And we have, all sorts of guests, international guests, but we do have a special focus on Chicago. And throughout this, decade of podcasting, I have used the publication you started, the Chicago Review of Books, as a resource because, like this podcast, you also have a special focus on Chicago, even though you cover all of literature. So I do want to say thank you for all of your work. And I thought I would start by just having you read from your preface to kind of hear how you got interested in Margaret Anderson.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dylan. I really appreciate it. All right, I'll pick up right here on page 4. I moved to Chicago from a small town exactly 100 summers after Margaret did the same. She came to the city to become something beautiful. I came to become a writer. Her first glimpse of the city was the same as mine, a stretch of Michigan Avenue between 19th century skyscrapers and the lake, with a smell of water across its asphalt and a soft gray light over its shops. On that same boulevard, I went to graduate school next door to the Fine Arts Building, where Margaret worked in a bookshop designed by Frank Lloyd Wright before founding the Little Review and opening its offices on the 9th floor. At the time, I only knew about the Fine Arts Building because a friend of mine was working as a waitress in a cafe on the ground floor. After eating lunch there one afternoon, I took Chicago's only remaining human-operated elevator up to the 10th floor and walked all the way back down. The Fine Arts Building was originally filled with horse-drawn carriage showrooms, but in 2008, when I discovered it, they had been replaced by concert halls, bookstores, and artist studios. On the 9th floor, I found a placard next to a locked door. The Little Review, Margaret Anderson, editor, circa 1914 to 1917. I wondered who this woman had been, and I read everything I could find about the Little Review. Over the next decade, I revisited the 9th floor every time I came to the Fine Arts Building for a concert or a book reading, and sat on the bench just outside Margaret's door. Eventually, inspired by Margaret, I would start a literary magazine of my own, the Chicago Review of Books, though I traded her Linotype press for WordPress. The Little Review and Ulysses changed history, but Margaret's influence changed the course of my life as well. She helped me realize I didn't need a lot of money, or a well-connected family, or a degree from a prestigious school, or a network of powerful friends to make something that would bring me joy. Totemic names like James Joyce, Sylvia Beach, Bennett Cerf, and dozens of other poets and writers stand on ground dug by Margaret. Yet narrative and scholarly accounts of Ulysses over the last century have marginalized her to a footnote or a few pages. Through sheer willpower, she forged an extraordinary life. And I apologize, I have a cold, and you can hear it in my voice.
Oh, that's okay. I do too, actually. You sound great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. It's fascinating. I also just happened in the last few months in preparation for Ulysses, and I've also been doing a series leading up to it on James Joyce's influences, looking at Ibsen, Oscar Wilde, and Yeats. And as part of that, I read Kevin Birmingham's book, The Most Dangerous Book, from, 2014, where indeed Margaret Anderson is a footnote, but a very interesting character, although I think you treat her more fairly. But there's also, I was teaching a class at the Newberry Library on contemporary Chicago literature, and I read Liesl Olson's book, Chicago Renaissance Literature and Art in the Midwest Metropolis. And she, of course, references Margaret Anderson. And she makes this really compelling argument that I wanted to ask you about leading off of that intro, where she says that because Chicago grew when it did, at a particular time in global capitalism and in a city that grew so fast, there weren't other established cultural institutions compared to New York or some of the other European capitals of culture and finance. Chicago was really open to modern art in new ways. And I guess I wonder if you agree with that for Margaret, but also it seems like that's still true today with your own life and work.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love that book by Liesl Olson. I read it well before I started working on this book, and also read the Birmingham book as well in my research for this. But yeah, I absolutely agree with what Liesl says there, and found that to be true in my research of all of the writers who were writing at the time the book is set in the 1910s, when this cultural renaissance was happening in the city. And a lot of them, just felt like New York was sort of an extension of Europe at the time, where there were a lot of sort of gatekeepers around literature and a lot of, old and hard to get into institutions. But Chicago was just like this empty space, right? This new playing field where they could do whatever they want, and people couldn't tell them no, and people couldn't kick them out because they could just build whatever they wanted to. And I think you see that in other arts as well in Chicago at the time, including architecture, right? Those first skyscrapers and lots of other, it was a playground for artists. So they could do whatever they wanted there because they didn't have to worry about all the old stuff that was in the way as it was in places like New York or Paris. So I think that is definitely true. And, Margaret herself, wrote about that in her memoirs, and that a lot of the bohemian, writers and artists that she was around in Chicago, who at the time, who are now household names, especially if you study Chicago, but at the time were just these sort of fringe weirdos that they couldn't get published, right? No one was really interested in their work at first, except for people like Margaret. So they feel the same way. And that's one of the reasons they were drawn to Chicago, particularly almost all these people that we study in American modernism came from the Midwest. It's a surprising number of them, Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and a lot of people in the book like Sherwood Anderson, Floyd Dell, came from the Midwest and were just drawn to Chicago like this sort of emerald city, right, of the Middle West at the time. And it's fascinating, the kind of art and literature that blossomed in the city at the time. And Olson does a great job of elucidating that in her book.
Yeah, and I think it's still true to some extent today.
Yes, I didn't.
Found, right.
Yeah, I didn't address that part of your question, but absolutely, I found that to be true. I found when I was in Chicago, I lived there for about 10 years, and the literary community there was just so open to anyone who wanted to show up at a bookstore or at an event and get to know people, from the most successful writers in the city, like Rebecca Mackay, on down to people like me who were really young and just starting out. Everyone was just very friendly, very open, very supportive of one another. Lots of mentorships and programs to encourage your career. It was very open and supportive. Not to throw places like New York under the bus, but I kind of have to because it is a little different in cities like that. So yeah, Chicago is still very much this, I think, playground for writing and literature.
Well, so you talk about Margaret Anderson's sheer willpower. She grew up in Indiana and described her family as criminal with how stultifying it was, and sought out Chicago as this, beacon and playground. It really seems like beauty becomes just this overwhelming theme for her. The pursuit of beauty, her insistence at getting to define beauty for herself. So she opens her memoir, 30 Years' War, with her, is it her mother correcting her handwriting? Margaret says, no, I like it this way. It's beautiful this way. And just this theme, even the opening flap of the book has this quote that it almost makes me cry, where when Margaret first reads Ulysses, that she's going to publish in her magazine, she says to Jane Heap, her romantic partner and sort of co-editor on the little review, "This is the most beautiful thing we'll ever have. We'll print it if it's the last effort of our lives." And similarly, that is something that is seen by many people as not beautiful. And she's saying, no, this is beautiful. And you keep also referring to just her view from Michigan Avenue, right, of the lake. I will quote one more thing to you here. You say this is one of her first trips to Chicago, maybe, or when she's first moved there. She immediately went to the ground floor flower shop, bought a bouquet of white lilacs, and had them sent up to her room and placed them in a vase against the lake, which became more blue than it ever has been since. That's a quote from her. The first evening in their hotel room at the Annex, Margaret could hear music from the nearby orchestra hall drifting through the windows. Sitting by her white lilacs, staring out at the lake, she watched the Chicago Harbor lighthouse cast its bright beacon across the darkness. Quote, "I began to repeat a vow to the rhythm of the light," she wrote. "I will become something beautiful." So this is just so inspiring. How does this insistence on beauty from Margaret, or her view of beauty, lead to the little review?
Yeah, thank you for quoting that. I found that part of her memoir really fascinating and moving, especially as a Chicagoan. And I thought it was very interesting that the lake was a muse of sorts for her as this very beautiful aspect of her life and her universe there in Chicago. She was definitely drawn to beauty, and I think that's one of the main reasons why she felt so trapped in the suburbs of Indianapolis at the turn of the century, which at the time were just very, very much still operating on Victorian gender roles, where young women like her were expected to just marry a man, have children, and be housewives and go to country clubs and play bridge, as she said. And she was just not interested in that at all. She found that not just boring, but also ugly. Like, that was an ugly life to her. And so she was absolutely drawn to beauty. And I think that was first defined for her as music. Music was sort of the first thing that she fell in love with. And this got cut from the book, but really what she says her first sort of interaction with beauty and her first experience of ecstasy was when she was extremely young, like 4 or 5, and she heard Silent Night for the first time. So Merry Christmas. Here we are on December 19th. And as she was listening to Silent Night, she found like a gift that she'd been given that year of a kitten for Christmas. And so it was associated with the excitement of this gift and hearing this song that just gave her this intense, emotional, almost spiritual sensation of ecstasy. And she wrote, this was when she was very old, like in her 70s, in her very last memoir, she wrote about how she realized then, looking back on her life, that really her entire pursuit of beauty that for all those years had been kind of chasing that experience of ecstasy that she had when she was a young child and trying to, recreate that in different ways. So I thought that was a very meaningful anecdote, because I think we all have those sort of early formative experiences with art or literature or visual beauty that then, I think we do spend, our adult lives chasing those highs through books or what have you. And I think that was really important to her. She certainly found it in Chicago.
Well, and not all of us follow that pursuit as ardently as she does. In the opening, the first issue of the little review, I mean, it's just fascinating. You trace how she's kind of trying to, work in the culture industry and writing a review of Sister Carrie, which then she gets kind of shot down. Well, why didn't you discuss the morals of the book? And those are obvious to everyone. And she says, well, they're not. They're not obvious to me. I'm here for the love of beauty. She also says, in the first issue, feminism, a clear-thinking magazine can only have one attitude. The degree of ours is ardent. And you can see this kind of cultivation of total openness, total excitement to all of the new ideas flowing. I wonder if you could just read Margaret Anderson's words from that first issue of the little review. It's on page 40 of your book.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you've ever read poetry with a feeling that it was your religion, your very life, if you've ever come suddenly upon the whiteness of a Venus in a dim, deep room, if you've ever felt music replacing your shabby soul with a new one of shining gold, if in the early morning you've watched a bird with great white wings fly from the edge of the sea straight up into the rose-colored sun, if these things have happened to you and continue to happen till you're left quite speechless with the wonder of it all, then you'll understand our hope to bring them nearer to the common experience of the people who read us. And I think that answers your question better than I did in terms of why did her pursuit of beauty lead to the little review? And I think she definitely felt stifled in her job, as you noted, reviewing books for the religious magazine that she was writing for. To her, interesting conversations were beautiful. I think she likened them to music. And so when she got this idea to start her own magazine, when she writes, just kind of hit her like a bolt of lightning in the middle of the night when she was depressed. The idea was, if I have my own magazine, I can create beautiful conversations, interesting conversations in that magazine. So I think that's kind of where it led to. She wasn't finding beauty in the venues she was writing for or reading at the time. So she decided to make her own.
And to do that, you have to create your own industry, right? You have to fund it somehow. And they're just these scenes are they're funny. You're just like awed at her. She's very beautiful. She'll go into office buildings and, she'll walk out with a check from some businessman. She reviewed the Mason and Hamlin pianos in one of the early reviews. And then she would go to the Mason and Hamlin showroom and say, well, I've reviewed your piano. You need to give me a free piano. And they would say, yeah, sure, of course. And this happens over and over again. I think you have 8 citations for pianos in residences. But I guess I'm wondering, there's a question I have about how these sort of, I almost want to call them stunts that she does, right? Like at one point, she'll convince these business people to give her money, but then they'll find out, well, she's publishing anarchists like Emma Goldman. So now we're pulling funding and now she's out of a house. And at one point, another local connection, she actually sets up camp in Highland Park, on a beach in Highland Park between Ravinia and Braeside, just, a couple miles from us here in Deerfield. And writers are coming, Ben Hecht, Sherwood Anderson, I think Emma Goldman, visiting her. People are pinning poems to her tent. It's very evocative. It does gather publicity. But I was sort of wondering how to interpret, how serious was she about her commitment to anarchism? Do these stunts sort of undermine her seriousness, or it seems like that's the wrong question, right? She is finding her own path.
I don't think it's the wrong question. I think it's right to interrogate her actual commitment to anarchism. And I think Emma Goldman did the same thing when she met Margaret. She was like, who is this like gorgeous society girl? This can't be the Margaret Anderson that wrote to me. But no, I think she found the ideas, well, I know from reading her memoirs and her correspondence, she initially found the ideas of anarchism fascinating and source of beauty in their own way when she first heard Emma Goldman speak on a lecture tour in Chicago. And so, yeah, for a few years there, in particular, during the Chicago era of the Little Review, she was very much enraptured by the ideas of anarchism. Did she apply them to her life? No. Did she become sort of a political activist in the way that Emma Goldman did? No. But she did find the ideas really interesting and wrote about them in her magazine very ardently, which got her into a lot of trouble, both with the funders of the magazine, who were these, like, as you noted, like businessmen that she convinced to give her money, including Frank Lloyd Wright, gave her $100, which was a lot of money at the time. Got her in trouble with those funders, most of whom said, sorry, we can't have anything to do with your magazine anymore. Like, we might lose our jobs. Because anarchism at the time was very much a taboo, like no-go.
Well, there were real bombs going off. It was serious business.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. There were actual anarchist terrorists, a few. Even more than that, it was this Red Scare, culture war thing where a lot of the more conservative, particularly conservative like white men in positions of power in America, successfully published a lot of propaganda that associated any immigrants, any brown people, any leftists with the extreme, violent terrorists who were anarchists. And so it was very much this social taboo at the time, unless you were an anarchist and willing to deal with the social fallout for that. So yeah, it lost her a lot of her funding, and it lost her landlords kept kicking her out wherever she lived. So that's why she writes that's why she wound up on the lake. I don't know. She's a very unreliable narrator of her own life. And so one of the challenges to writing this biography was interrogating her record and finding other corroborating sources. She gets her timeline mixed up a lot. She exaggerates. She's this sort of breathless, hyperbolic, writer. And so it would not surprise me if she didn't really have to live by the lake for 6 months. It wouldn't surprise me if she knew that would be a good, publicity stunt. And if it was partially motivated by that, I wouldn't be surprised. But I mean, she did, from what we can tell, lose her financial support from her parents right before that happened, because she had this big falling out with her mother after the death of her father. And, she wasn't making a lot of money reviewing books. So, I don't think she's lying about the fact that money was low. Even though she wasn't paying contributors to the little review,
Right.
it still cost money to print it every month and to keep her office in the Fine Arts Building.
Well, it's fascinating because it's part of modernism's like self-mythology too, is to perform a sort of stunt that no one has done before. And she would do things like print a issue of the magazine that had blank pages and said, "We're here to print art and this is a want ad. Like, we don't have art to print. There's nothing good enough." And then in the same issue, there's a cartoon where she's making fun of herself as the editor. And there's little images of her saying she practices 18 hours a day and takes her Mason and Hamlin to bed with her. And even this, again, it's like, how seriously is she taking this? She's suffering for humanity at Emma Goldman's lectures. And it's just so...
That was Jane Heap. Jane
Heap
okay. Drew and
really?
And captioned those. That was Jane Heap's first contribution to the little review, actually.
Oh my God.
Was that cartoon, yeah.
Well, it's so interesting because I've, been tracing like Joyce's own inspiration from someone like Ibsen. Like Emma Goldman would lecture about Ibsen and say, he wants I have a quote here. "Ibsen consistently strove to uproot every stone of our social structure. Above all did thunder his fiery indictment against the four cardinal sins of modern society, the lie inherent in our social arrangements, sacrifice and duty, the twin curses that fetter the spirit of man, the narrow-mindedness and pettiness of provincialism that stifles all growth, and the lack of joy and purpose in work, which turns life into a veil of misery and tears." I think, even for all these stunts, what's so amazing, helpful to me about your work is that it's grounding, putting the context around this literature on this real revolution against those sort of Victorian values.
Yeah, thank you. And I think a second answer to your previous question kind of comments on this, which is that for Margaret, when she first sort of fell in love with anarchism, which I do think part of that was she was kind of in love with Emma Goldman when she saw her speak. And there's a little bit of evidence that they may have had an affair from some correspondence. But I said in my book, there's no explicit direct evidence that they did. But if I were a betting man, they at least
that would explain Jane Heap's little dig there in the cartoon, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it does. But Margaret initially saw anarchism as very much like in line with modernism, with literary modernism. And what she didn't call it that because no one called it modernism yet. But with these new ideas in art and literature to sort of break the Victorian mold and do things differently and bravely. And so that was another reason she was really attracted to anarchism at first. But once she spent more time with Emma Goldman and the people around her, she became very disillusioned with them because they didn't really care about art the way that she did.
Right.
Like they cared about changing society in a very political, social way, and they just were not. They thought art was kind of a silly waste of time that couldn't do those things. Whereas Margaret, like some of her other modernist contemporaries at the time, really believed that art could do those things too. But once she realized, Emma Goldman and Berkman and all those other, Big Bill Haywood that were hanging around Emma at the time didn't feel that way about art. She was very heartbroken by that. And she figured this out when she was in California for a bit near San Francisco. And after that point, kind of just stopped writing about anarchism in the magazine and never really went back to it.
So what we're sort of talking about here is like, how do you create a container for beauty? Like that's sort of what Margaret is wondering. And I thought I would ask you about Ezra Pound and John Quinn. I just kind of want to ask you to talk about how they came into her life and the way she would butt up against them. I mean, she comes off looking much better than these maybe more well-known figures. I mean, John Quinn, the things that, even though this is the lawyer who's defending Margaret Anderson, the stuff he's saying privately, but also in court, is really kind of demeaning her intelligence, using all these homophobic, sexist language. It's really wild.
Yeah, John Quinn was abhorrently bigoted against women, against immigrants, against Jewish people, against Black people. I mean, really anyone who wasn't, white Irish man like himself, he was extremely bigoted towards. And that was one of the more fascinating things about this story for me, is that, John Quinn was both James Joyce's financial sponsor in a lot of ways, Ezra Pound's financial sponsor in a lot of ways, the Little Review's financial sponsor, literally all three of those, but also had this real disdain and hatred, particularly for Margaret and Jane as the editors of the magazine, but then wound up being their lawyer during both of their obscenity trials, both the James Joyce one and an earlier one for publishing Wyndham Lewis. So it's just such a fascinating, contrast between what he believed and what he did as their lawyer, and all that because it was really important to him that James Joyce become an international success, because Joyce was Irish, Quinn was Irish. He had this sort of nationalistic pride in Ireland. He wanted to make Joyce, the next Shakespeare. And so Margaret couldn't pay Joyce for his work, but Quinn would pay Ezra Pound money, and then Pound would pay Joyce for the material that he was printing in Margaret's magazine. And they came into Margaret's life, through the magazine, because Ezra Pound had been writing and been a foreign editor for Harriet Monroe's magazine, Poetry, also based in Chicago and also founded in the Fine Arts Building. And so Margaret and Harriet knew one another, and Margaret had published a few poems of Ezra's in the Little Review. And then Ezra Pound started to feel a little stifled in Harriet's magazine and Poetry. And so he wrote to Margaret and said, "Hey, could I be your foreign editor and, publish my friends, Wyndham Lewis, James Joyce, Yeats, as you mentioned, all of that work, being funded by John Quinn." And Margaret had told a lot of people no, who had offered to contribute in that way to the magazine in the past, but was just really enthralled by Pound's mind at the time. And so she said yes. She did not give him editorial control. Like, he would send her things that she would throw in the trash. He would give her suggestions on how to print things or how to cut things up or add footnotes, and she would ignore him and say, like, no, we're not going to do that. So I think there, particularly among 20th century scholars, there's this idea that, all the great stuff that the Little Review did was during its New York period with Joyce and then those Europeans was because of Pound. But Margaret was still very much the editorial force behind that magazine when all of that was happening.
Yeah. And she understood, I think, she certainly understood Joyce, I think, better than Quinn did. Quinn is defending at one point. I have to read this passage from your book here. So this is Quinn in court. He established James Joyce's credentials as a celebrated man of letters. He admitted that filth existed in literature, but argued that there was a difference between, quote, the strong, hard filth of a man like Joyce and, quote, a soft, flabby man like Oscar Wilde, who had spent 2 years in prison during the 1890s for the offense of having committed gross indecency with other men. Quinn explained that Joyce's brand of filth in Ulysses would actually deter young people from having sex, and used a particularly misogynistic anecdote to illustrate this point. And he says, well, if Joyce makes women seem really real, then people will be turned off, by them. So you're not going to be aroused by this. This won't be a danger to the minds of young girls because it's too real. This is such a misreading of both Joyce and of Oscar Wilde. And again, as I've been doing this series, I have to read you this quote that I started using in every book discussion from the Joyce scholar Vicky Mahaffey. In 1994, she wrote, coupled together James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, from which Joyce drew the first part of his title, expose the complementary parental mechanisms by which children are corrupted. And in both cases, the child is corrupted not by homosexuality, but by homophobia, not by openness, but by secrecy, not by the real, but by the objectifying force of the ideal. And this is, I think, what Margaret understood. And it's the same thing Ibsen knew, Hedda Gabler kills herself for this objectifying force of the ideal, or Yeats wants to hammer himself into gold. But this is something Margaret Anderson knew even while people are saying, well, you can't read this passage in court because she's just a woman.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very insightful quote that you just read about Wilde and Joyce. And Margaret was absolutely ahead of the curve, recognizing the brilliance of Ulysses when even her own readers, even her own subscribers, like her most ardent fans of the magazine who had been on board for all the weird fringe stuff she was publishing in Chicago, they hated Ulysses. They kept writing into the magazine saying, well, what has happened? You guys are embarrassing yourselves. Like, what this stuff is gross. It doesn't make any sense. Understand it. Like, what are you doing? But she didn't care. She thought it was beautiful, and that's all that mattered, not her readers. And Quinn, the lawyer who spent all this money on Pound and who represented Margaret in court twice because he was so desperate to make sure that Joyce's work was legal to publish, he hated Ulysses, at least at first. There's this great scene where he's like recovering from surgery that he thought was going to kill him. And he, his aide delivers him the first chapters of Ulysses that have been published in a little review. And John Quinn basically has a panic attack because he's like, what have I done? I thought I was uplifting the Irish Shakespeare of the 20th century, and this is just like gross toilet humor, he called it. He eventually came, or at least he writes to Pound and Joyce that he came around and appreciated it, but I don't know how much of that was genuine. And so that's one of the great ironies is that Quinn himself, I do not think recognized what was brilliant and valuable about Ulysses or a lot of Joyce's writing. And anything that he said in court was bullshit. He was just trying to win his case. And, a lot of, even Margaret and Joyce and Pound at the time didn't necessarily agree with the tactics he was using in the court to argue the case. But he was obviously a very successful lawyer, so they just kind of did what he said in hopes of staying out of prison and being able to print their magazine and their book.
Well, and Margaret and Jane Heap, they would print the criticism from readers, and then they would respond, and they would also say, you quote Margaret saying, I know practically everything that will be said in court, both by the prosecution and the defense. I disagree with practically everything that will be said by both. I do not admit that the issue is debatable. James Joyce has never written anything and will never be able to write anything that is not beautiful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, some of that is sort of her own idiosyncratic definition of beauty and what she found beautiful. But I think it's clear 100 years later that she recognized something much sooner than other people did. And then she and Jane both were shocked at the discrepancy between the reception that they received from Ulysses between, 1917, 1918, and 1921 when the trial occurred. And then the reception that it received just a year later when Sylvia Beach published it in France, when all of a sudden it was being heralded as this masterpiece. When they were publishing, everyone hated it, and they couldn't convince anybody to write about it, really, to cover it in the newspapers or magazines that spoke about literature. It was just dismissed as this like weird, gross folly.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden it was this masterpiece of a generation and got, glowing reviews in places like the New Republic and the Times in London. They were really heartbroken by that and confused and I think disillusioned with the idea of publishing literature because it just didn't seem fair to them. And one of the things I wanted to cover in the book is the, I think, underappreciated, undercovered impact that their publishing and their criminal trial made on Ulysses as a book that influenced how successful it was when Beach published it. Because when Beach published it in 1922, in France, it was this forbidden fruit because it had been banned in the United States. So that had drummed up, not initially. I mean, it was covered in the New York Times when their trial happened, but by the time it was published there, word had spread and it had become this taboo, banned book. And so there was a lot of excitement to get, for people to get their hands on this book. And that was like a brilliant unintended piece of guerrilla marketing, right? For the book. So I don't know that it would have had the same immediate impact that it did in France were it not for Margaret and the trial.
I thought I would do something here to try to get at what is the actual danger of Ulysses. And one of the major issues in court was this famous scene in the Nausicaa episode where Gertie McDowell, who's a young woman, her age is sort of debated. Maybe she's 17 to 22 or something. She realizes she's being watched by Leopold Bloom, who's 38, and she's sort of showing off her knickers, right, to him. And we go into the mind of Gertie. And your book made me read this passage in a new way. So when I was thinking about Margaret being called a danger to the minds of young girls, as she writes in her own words when, they are fined for publishing this obscene material, I was thinking, how would this girl from Indiana read this passage? This lesbian woman who wants openness, newness, beauty, and sophistication, but also wants to include, everything ugly that's supposedly not beautiful. So I'm just going to read a little bit here of Ulysses. But Gertie was adamant. She had no intention of being at their beck and call. If they could run like Rosie's, she could sit. So she said she could see from where she was. The eyes that were fastened upon her set her pulses tingling. She looked at him a moment, meeting his glance, and a light broke in upon her. White-hot passion was in that face, passion silent as the grave, and it had made her his. At last, they were left alone without the others to pry and pass remarks, and she knew he could be trusted to the death, steadfast, a sterling man, a man of inflexible honor to his fingertips. His hands and face were working, and a tremor went over her. She leaned back far to look up where the fireworks were, and she caught her knee in her hands so as not to fall back, looking up. And there was no one to see, only him and her, when she revealed all her graceful, beautifully shaped legs like that, supply soft and delicately rounded. And she seemed to hear the panting of his heart, his hoarse breathing, because she knew too about the passion of men like that, hot-blooded, because Bertha Supple told her once in dead secret and made her swear she'd never, about the gentleman lodger that was staying with them out of the congested districts board that had pictures cut out of papers of those skirt dancers and high knickers, and she said he used to do something not very nice that you could imagine sometimes in the bed. But this was altogether different from a thing like that, because there was all the difference, because she could almost feel him draw her face to his and the first quick, hot touch of his handsome lips. Besides, there was absolution so long as you didn't do the other thing before being married, and there ought to be women priests that would understand without your telling out. So I'm going to stop there. That's partway through a sentence, but that part, there ought to be women priests that would understand without your telling out. You write, by leaning back, Gertie became a willing participant. I'm quoting you here, in the obscenity instead of a victim. By asserting her sensuality, she represented one of the most terrifying archetypes of the new woman in America, the sexually active daughter. But more than that, thinking about Margaret reading this, I was realizing that wish for understanding, that there might be somebody like Margaret could be for the young girls who might read this, that would understand. She could be a sort of priest of literature in that way. And I just have to thank you for that reading, because it really unlocks something for me.
Yeah, that's fascinating to think of, because she herself had no real mentor or model of that, as she's sort of as Gertie is sort of wishing for in that passage. Margaret had not had anyone like that. Her mother was this very conservative, anxious Christian scientist who really seemed to just make Margaret miserable. I'm sure, she may have been more three-dimensional than how Margaret described her, but, she had not had a maternal or paternal figure who was really understanding. And I do think she wanted to be that herself as a champion for this kind of literature. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of why this passage in particular seemed to be such a danger to the minds of young girls. It wasn't because, Bloom masturbates in his pants
Right.
or because of any of the sort of anatomical details there. I mean, those things definitely caught the eyes of the judges, but I think the real nail in the coffin for the obscenity trial was that Gertie was aware of what was happening and was, by leaning back, was encouraging this. And that was terrifying for, Victorian era conservative parents, particularly the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant parents of the day, who were really scared that reading something like this would make their daughters want to have sex and want to explore their sexuality. And their greatest fear, right, is that they would have sex with an immigrant or a leftist or an anarchist.
They're not supposed to, right?
Well, they're not supposed to. And, I noted, I looked at the New York Times the weeks of the trial to see what else was going on in the world at this time. And the day before the trial, the front page of the New York Times was, quoting the health commissioner of the city of New York about how these disease-infested vermin were landing at the ports of the city, being from other countries, and how they were, infected with STDs and things like that. So, yeah, I think the Ogden Browers of the world, and that's the father who wound up referring this case to the district attorney because his daughter got this unsolicited copy of the magazine. Parents like him were just really terrified of this idea of the new woman who had agency over her own sexuality, because they thought this would send them, running to whorehouses or becoming prostitutes or becoming, disease-ridden or lesbians, right? That was a terrifying thing too, and realize that, or want to explore, same-sex relationships. So that was scary as well for them.
Well, the thing I wanted to ask you about actually was to ask about this sort of, I thought of it as like a tension in the book, and it has to do with your methods as a writer. There's a few times you reference contemporary film. So you'll say, when Margaret and Heap first met Pound and Joyce face to face after exchanging letters for years, you say it was the modernist literature equivalent of the Empire State Building scene at the end of Nora Ephron's Sleepless in Seattle. Or then later in life, Margaret and Jane and other modernist writers will get involved with Gurdjieff. I'm not sure how you say it. This very interesting sort of new age philosopher and kind of cult leader. And you say, if this sounds like a plot, his background, to an Indiana Jones movie, that's because it too was fiction. And I wondered, because I feel this tension all the time of a library worker, teacher, podcaster, of trying to, popularize, make understandable this literature that is partly about bringing you into a place of not understanding. So I sort of wanted to just ask you about your thinking behind that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And I think some of it is just my own, that's how my brain works. I make comparisons between old things and new things. But I think my biggest goal when I'm writing about history is to try to help people understand and help myself understand what things were really like in that period of time, what life felt like and how the cultural artifacts that we study today actually made an impact back then, because it's hard. You hear about Sister Carrie or The Sun Also Rises or Ulysses or something, and it's completely divorced now from the sociocultural impact that it made at the time. And like, we have experienced our own now pop culture phenomenons and understand what happened with K-pop Demon Hunters, and we know what what kind of impact that had on society and what that phenomenon was like. Maybe that's a bad example because it was just, it was really popular, but it hasn't like changed. There's not a lot of discourse around it or anything. It hasn't changed much. So that might not be the best example. But my goal with those like contemporary references is just to try to help people understand better the impact that some of these things made at the time, or to help them just picture things more easily. I compare, I think, Anthony Comstock to Orson Welles and his successor to Cary Grant, just to try to, like, I could talk about what they look like and I could talk about what kind of men they were, but I think telling you who I would cast them as in a Hollywood production, in the 1950s or whatever, just is a sort of a shorthand for helping you picture these two men as a writer who likes to compare things. But
yeah, it's fascinating to me because this is also a tension in Joyce too. Like, he would, write to a critic sort of explaining his whole schema of connecting episodes of Ulysses to the Odyssey. And then he would write and say, oh, wait, don't publish that. I take it back. Like, he wants to be known, but he doesn't want to be known. And there's this quote, it's a documentary about Joyce, is titled, "Is There One Who Understands Me?" And apparently it's what he asked his partner, Nora Barnacle, when they were leaving Ireland. He didn't say, "Will you go with me?" He said, "Is there one who understands me?" And spoiler alert for Finnegan's Wake, but that line, "Is there one who understands me?" is in the last pages of Finnegan's Wake. It's so moving. All these modernists, they want to challenge you. They want you to be comfortable with not understanding and getting every reference. But at the same time, they want you to understand, and they'll use, like Margaret Anderson would use, money from any source, right? They'll use anything. So I sort of thought about it that way with your book too. Like, we have to use everything to attract people into doing that mysterious work of encountering modernism.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great way to put it. And maybe some of that for me comes from having taught undergraduate students and
right.
being desperate for ways to get them interested in this really old stuff.
Yeah. Right. It's that 30 Rock joke, Jay-Z and Shakespeare don't have much in common, or do they? Like, that the cool teacher would say.
Yeah, exactly.
So then I want to ask about the last part of Margaret's life and this sort of disillusionment, because she seems to understand Joyce more than anyone else. And then when they're ending the magazine, she's writing and saying, "I'm not interested in art anymore. I'm interested in illumination." And you write, whether she could admit it to herself or not, she liked orderly systems so long as they were ordered in a way that made sense to her. It seemed to her that modernist grenades like Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland had blown up the old without rebuilding anything new. It felt to her as if the era of discernible movements in literature and art was over, and she believed that she had helped bring them to an end. And then she gets involved with this whole system and this other difficult writer, but its difficulty, it seems like Gurdjieff and this whole philosophy is difficulty and meanness, not for the sake of understanding, I don't know, for the sake of his own ego or project or something. I guess the other thing I would just put on the table there is, you also quote when Margaret does meet Joyce saying, "He gave me the impression of having less escape from suffering about irremediable things than anyone else I have known." And that, I think, is also part of the wisdom of Joyce. And how do you think about this? Is this a tragedy that she couldn't live that out, or is that something we can only live out on the page? I mean, she sought out this really weird sort of ending philosophy to her life. Or is that a continuation of modernism's, systems of universality?
I think it's, for her, it was both. And reading it definitely feels like both. And it feels like a tragedy to me. And it was challenging as a writer, right, to have this first act where she's growing up and escaping and trying new things, and the second act where she's a criminal, for doing what she did with the magazine, and then the third act where she really just kind of disappears from public view and pursues some pretty esoteric things in France in an anticlimactic way, right? I mean, she does not publish or write. I mean, she does publish and write some memoirs, but they just kind of go unnoticed during this whole really second half of her life that the last third of the book covers. And I think Joyce was an artist and Gurdjieff was a charlatan, but Margaret couldn't tell the difference between the two. I think she was attracted to Gurdjieff for similar reasons as she was attracted to Joyce. They both said very similar things about their work. I quote in the book where Joyce talks about wanting scholars to puzzle over his books for centuries or something, and Gurdjieff says he hides the bones so deep, bizarre novels that I could not finish his work. I finished Ulysses in writing this, but I did not finish Gurdjieff's. I think there is a real sense of tragedy there in the fact that she had become disillusioned with literature, partially for personal reasons, right? Because she had gone through this ordeal and had not been recognized for it. And Sylvia Beach and then Bennett Cerf had sort of gotten all the credit, Ulysses, despite her own sacrifices that she made. So part of that was a personal disillusionment. But I think, too, she and Jane Heap and Floyd Dell and Sherwood Anderson and a lot of modernists who were writing before and after World War I really had this very optimistic hope for what this new kind of writing and new kind of art that we call modernism could do to society and to the world. I think they really believed, like, we can make a difference in the world. The world can be a better place if we can, break these Victorian chains off. But then World War I happened, and it was just the most horrific, hellish nightmare. I think it's hard for us today to even conceive how just absolutely horrifying the First World War was in the 1910s. And that was disillusioning for a lot of those people who just thought, we thought this could make a difference, but like, look at what happened. And then a lot of their writing after that was obviously inspired by the war. But then the Great Depression happened, World War II happened, right? This all happened. And so she just became very disillusioned with the power of art to do anything meaningful. And I think was initially very attracted to Gurdjieff because she thought, well, if literature can't do it, maybe spirituality can. Really completely mystifying. Like, could not, despite trying for decades, could not understand like what this guy was talking about or wanted them to do. And so, yeah, in the end, she became very sad, I think, and disillusioned about her exploits, the things she was trying to do when she was younger, and also just the idea of like art, literature, spirituality, and what they can do for a person in addition to what they can do for the world. Use another like present day-ish metaphor here. I compare her initial or her eventual like disillusionment with modernism and with new writing and art and literature to the way I think a lot of Star Wars fans felt about Rian Johnson's movie, The Last Jedi, where, in that movie, that's the one where, Luke Skywalker returns, but he like throws his lightsaber off of a cliff behind him and he like tries to destroy the old Jedi books that he's kept this whole time. There's a lot of sort of dismissal of the old way, that, and turning a new leaf, right? And we're like replacing the old stuff with something new. But that movie and the one that followed it does not replace the old way with anything new. It just kind of throws everything out, but doesn't even like suggest or hint at, well, like, what are we doing next? Like, what's better now than about what was then? You could say that Rian Johnson's movie like hints at it at the end, right? With this scene of a little boy looking up, and maybe it's like there's going to be a working class sort of social that comes out of that movie. But I think a lot of Star Wars fans, a lot of them love that movie, so I don't want to pigeonhole them. But for me, not being a huge Star Wars person, but having enjoyed some of the other movies, it just felt like just throwing things out for the sake of, blowing things up for the sake of blowing them up, and not having a vision of like, well, what's next? Like, why are we doing this? And I think Margaret had a very similar reaction or experience after she saw what Ulysses and The Wasteland did and the impact that it made on art and literature. Because by the time she was writing her last memoirs in the 60s, she hated like the popular literature and art of that time. And she wrote about how she was very contemptuous of it. And it's funny too, because, she was initially the very edge of the sword in the 1910s and 1920s in terms of like new culture and counterculture. But by the time she's old, she is now the conservative.
Sure.
A lot of ways who thinks like the 1960s counterculture is weird and gross. So it's ironic that she then kind of became the other side of that coin. That was a very long rambling answer to your question.
No, I loved it. And because there's let me see if I can square this also, because there's an opportunity. Again, if we separate the objectifying force of the ideal, there's an opportunity to find beauty in disillusionment. And while perhaps Margaret did not do that, you end with this romance novel that she wrote about her kind of second great love, who was kind of an older European version of herself, who would also do artistic stunts and things. It's really beautiful, this kind of late in life romance, even though they were involved with this cult leader. You end with this quote from that romance novel that was eventually published. "I shan't say that it lasted forever. It had a deeper time, a time in height and depth. It gave us unbearable partings, unbelievable meetings, a full lifespan. It had its ending, but it never came to its end." I think that in that I might find some of that beauty in disillusionment, or in what she saw in Joyce being so affected by the irremediable, or whatever, irremediable. I thought, if you'll indulge me, I would give the last word to Joyce, even though Margaret does deserve her time in the sun. But this was another section that you quote in the book that was held up as part of indecency. And it's Leopold Bloom thinking about his wife, Molly. They haven't had sex in 10 years after she birthed a boy, Rudy, and he died after 11 days. But he's drinking a glass of wine, and these memories flood back to him. And it's so beautiful, and it's also beautiful in its disillusionment and remembrance of how wonderful things were in the past. Glowing wine on his palate lingered swallowed, crushing in the wine-pressed grapes of Burgundy. Sun's heat it is, seems to a secret touch telling me memory. Touched his sense, moistened, remembered, hidden under wild ferns on Howth below us, bay sleeping. Sky. No sound. The sky. The bay purple by the Lion's Head. Green by Drumleck. Yellow-green towards Sutton. Fields of undersea, the lines faint brown in grass, buried cities. Pillowed on my coat she had her hair, earwigs in the heather scrub, my hand under her nape. You'll toss me all. Oh, wonder! Cool, soft, with ointments her hand touched me, caressed. Her eyes upon me did not turn away. Ravished over her I lay, full lips full open, kissed her mouth. Yum! Softly she gave me in my mouth the seed cake warm and chewed. Mawkish pulp her mouth had mumbled, sweet sour of her spittle. Joy, I ate it, joy. Young life, her lips that gave me pouting. Soft, warm, sticky gum jelly lips. Flowers her eyes were, take me, willing eyes. Pebbles fell, she lay still, a goat, no one. High on Benhouth rhododendrons, a nanny goat walking sure-footed, dropping currants. Screened under ferns, she laughed warm-folded. Wildly I lay on her, kissed her. Eyes, her lips, her stretched neck beating, women's breasts full in her blouse of nun's veiling, fat nipples upright. Hot, I tongued her. She kissed me. I was kissed. All yielding, she tossed my hair. Kissed. She kissed me. It's so beautiful.
It is. It is. And I think there is a connection there that you're making to what he wrote there, and sort of the amplifying nature that time has on a memory, to the end of Margaret's life and to the things that she wrote about the loves of her life and the beauty that she pursued. And I wanted to end with that quote of hers too, because there's this sort of gothic beauty to it for me of, that amplifying effect of time and of grief and of loss, that it can make things more beautiful. Like disillusionment, loss, grief are obviously terrible feelings in a lot of ways, but I think they can have this amplifying intensity on good memories and on beautiful things, and can make them more beautiful and make you appreciate them even more than maybe you did as they were occurring in the present. And I think there is some redemption in that and some beauty in that. I don't know if I'm getting too.
Yeah, I mean, and that starts with, the beauty of the lake in Chicago and all those beautiful green colors. And I just want to thank you so much. I have to use Margaret's word and just say this is really beautiful. So thank you, Adam.
Thank you so much for such a close reading of this and just really thoughtful questions and really thoughtful connections between my book, Margaret's writing, Joyce's writing. This was really meaningful for me. So thank you so much, Dylan.
You can check out A Danger to the Minds of Young Girls here at the library in our podcast collection, where we have books and other materials by all our past podcast guests. Find out more about Adam on his website, adam-stephen-morgan.com. That's Stephen with a PH, like in Ulysses. Find links to all of those on our blog post and in our show notes. That's our show. A big thank you to Adam for taking the time to talk to us, and thank you for listening to our 70th interview episode. Comments and feedback are always welcome and can be sent to podcast@deerfieldlibrary.org. We always appreciate a rating and review as well. Go to deerfieldlibrary.org/podcast to learn more about our show and find links to subscribe. You can also follow the library on our social media or check out our YouTube channel. Links are on our website or in the show notes. We'll be back soon. Thanks for listening.